Good. Well, a very warm welcome, first of all, from myself, and at the risk of boring some of you regulars, I'll just say something briefly about who I am and the organization I initiated. I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which took the form, as some of you will know, I think, of a sort of real life nationwide year-long arts festival that ran from March 2019 to March 2020, celebrating and looking in much more detail than is normally the case at the huge, pervasive and rich contribution of the so-called Hitler émigrés, the refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe, to this country's culture. And then, of course, COVID intervened with a vengeance, but luckily for me, the obvious thing was to go online. And since then, since June Refugee Week 2020, I've been responsible for an ongoing, very much an ongoing program of online events on topics related to that rich terrain. And again, as some of you may know, one of the sort of logical offshoots, certainly in my own mind, has been to invite members of the so-called second generation, the children and sometimes even the grandchildren, the third generation of that remarkable generation, to talk about their own creative responses to their family's remarkable histories. And of course, Stephen fits the bill very well in that respect. So yes, and I'll also just mention now, unless so I don't forget about it later, that he gave a wonderful talk about his wonderful mother, the poet Beata Duncan, as part of the Zoom events that I've just been referring to, which took place. I was just telling him, I can't believe it's quite so long ago. It was on the 28th of July 2020, and it was recorded, as indeed this one will be recorded too, and can be found, if you're interested in pursuing that further, on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. Very good. We've still got people coming in. I'm just quickly. If I could ask you all, I think you all know the ropes by now, ad nauseam, to remain muted. And if you wouldn't mind addressing any questions or comments you may have in the chat, try and address them to me, Monica Boomdooch, and rather to everyone, so we don't distract Stephen as he's talking. Lovely. So I think, let me, without further ado, say a very little bit about Stephen. He's going to be talking, it is a sort of autobiographical presentation he's giving today, so I'll keep it very brief. He is a poet as well as a sculptor, and Stephen, maybe we'll have time, if you wish, to say something about that later. But today's emphasis is going to be on his career as a sculptor, a visual artist. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Sculptors, and indeed that's where you should go to find out more about his work, or rather more images as well. Well, actually, we're going to see images, but that's another useful source of information. He's going to be talking about his career both in this country, but also in Italy. He trained at the University of the Arts here in London, also the Royal Academy of Arts, and the Accademia di Belle Arti in Rome. He kickstarted his career, by his own admission, I think, by working and sort of becoming engaged with a number of rather remarkable figures, both émigrés and homegrown artists, among them Michael Werner and Gertrude Hermes, also Willy Sukop and Riccardo Priulli, all of them in their different ways, apart from Hermes, who I think is British born, isn't he? Isn't she, Stephen, very much from an immigrant background. What is that noise? Can everybody make sure that they're muted, please? I shall have to address this in a minute. Good, I think that's probably enough, isn't it, by way of introduction, Steve? Over to you. Over to you. That's certainly not me as far as I can tell. Let me just check who is not muted. Stephen, do start and try not to be distracted. I will try and make sure that noise stops. Can't see who. Is it David? Okay, that's very odd. Everybody seems to be muted. My apologies. Okay, over to Stephen.
Yeah, just sorry. Okay. Yeah, so sorry, we're just making sure. Yeah, that's it. Great. Okay,
that's it. That's perfect.
You got it. Yeah. Okay. When this is a view of my studio currently, with a series of sculptures that I'm making at the moment, but I did want to sort of put this talk into the context of Monica's amazing festival that she's been doing. When I first started coming to the events for the festival a couple of years ago, before the pandemic started, I knew quite a lot about what that contribution that Monica had referred to had made to this country in the 30s and 40s. I hadn't quite realized how rich it was. I I was actually very, very surprised at how many artists, musicians, architects, choreographers, etc., in the arts had made their mark, had coped with that whole problem of being a refugee, and had come here and made their mark here. Obviously, I knew what something of my mother's life, because you know, she'd been a refugee in '34 and came over and started her career here. But one of the things that I kept thinking about during those first talks was what these refugees had brought over in terms of the culture of Europe. And I'd like to talk a bit about that, but also what had happened in subsequent generations, what in terms of that particular hybridization of European and British cultures. And I think it's a sort of theme that I was really struck by when I was in the post-war modern art show at the Barbican, which is a survey of British art from 45 to 65, which is on at the Barbican at the moment, as well as the Life Between the Islands show at the Tate, how much this particular issue of people coming from other parts of the world coming to Britain, and then what that effect is, what that influence is. I think it's a really, really powerful territory. So I thought that maybe this idea of the artist as hybrid, which is the title of my talk, is something that we could explore a bit more in the question and answer period after this talk. And so I'm really hoping that all of you clever people will throw in some really good questions on this. I'm going to start actually by talking a bit about my childhood. If I can just, sorry, not getting this to move. This isn't moving. Sorry, just there's a little.
Stephen, what I find, if I can just interrupt, if it gets stuck, which it occasionally does, if you quite literally click your cursor top left of the screen, or possibly anywhere on the screen, it tends to unstick it. Yeah, there you are. Goodness knows why it works, but it does.
Okay. This isn't something I would normally do. I often give lectures about my work and my current work at art schools and universities. But actually, I thought I would start off by talking about my childhood, because it seems to me that my childhood was very much, you know, post-war, those post-war decades were very much embedded within this, the after effects, or the sort of still continuing territory of what had been contributed during the 30s and 40s by this influx of refugees. And I thought, and I actually met three of these particular people. Michael Werner, who came from Germany, sculptor. Willy Sukop, another sculptor, came from Austria. Riccardo Priulli, who came from Italy. And they all came through, well, Michael Werner and Riccardo came through Paris and came to this country just before the war started. Willy Sukop had already been in this country, was working at Dartington Hall, brought over from Vienna by some by two English ladies. He'd been teaching there. He'd literally been starving in Austria and had needed the work here. But what's also interesting about them is that all three of them were interned. Michael Werner and Riccardo Priulli were interned in the Isle of Man, and Willy Sukop was shipped off to Canada for several years, which is sort of another theme that Monica's been exploring, this whole business of the so-called enemy aliens who were interned. All three of them, when they talked to me about their internship, didn't show any resentment towards the British. They just thought it was a bit stupid because they had so much to offer. And this sort of sense of what they had to offer, I think, was something that struck me continually during my my early years. These are all sculptures. I started making art 10, 11, 12. I was painting and drawing. I came from my mother was somebody very interested in painting. There were no artists in our family, but the whole idea of, she was also a socialist, so she believed that the National Gallery and the Tate Gallery were open to everybody. And she did actually tell me as a child that we actually owned all the paintings, which I thought was quite interesting. I remember saying to her, well, why can't we take them home? And she said, no, they're looked after here. You know, it's a sort of very good Labour Party socialist sort of attitude towards culture. And I started making sculpture very quickly, really excited, I think, by what was going on around me and the sort of group of sculptors who were emerging and who were being shown at the Venice Biennales. people like Ken Armitage, Lynn Chadwick, Jeffrey Clark, Eduardo Palozzi, Liz Frink, who I thought was just amazing, some of her early work. I saw a show of Peter Lanyon, which I just thought was terrific. This is also around about 10, 11, 12. And I very quickly got going. I realized that it was very easy to make sculpture in a way. The piece on the left was made out of a couple of old gas pipes that I found on a building site. And I think you need to know that until the sort of 70s, 80s, London still had a lot of bomb sites. It was still very much being rebuilt. There were all sorts of sites where you could, as a child, you could wander around and find things, you know, old toys, old bits of building rubbish, bits of architecture. And the piece on the left was I made about when I was about 13, 14, 2 gas pipes, various objects that I worked from, modeling up in plaster. I think very much it's influenced by the Geometry of Fear group of sculptors that I've just mentioned, the Geometry of Fear, which is something that the critic Herbert Reed coined for this sort of post-war group of sculptors who I think Herbert Reed was sort of trying to sort of imply that we were still living in a period of fear with the Cold War that had started post-war. The one in the middle, I think, is very much influenced by Modigliani. And the one on the right is very much, quite obviously, like a Henry Moore. These were all pieces I was making in my early teens. Camden Art Centre is a place that I very much credit. They had a really good sculpture workshop there, which I could go and use. But my mother was also very tolerant, allowed me to turn my bedroom into a workshop, which was pretty good. And the local DIY store was very helpful with bags of plaster and any tools that I needed. They seemed to sort of find it quite interesting that this kid was doing this. And I financed it all by doing a milk round on Sunday mornings. But a friend of mine said, oh, you've got to meet this sculptor I know called Michael Werner. So I then went to, I was then introduced to this chap, Michael Werner. This is a maquette of a large, a maquette for a large figure that he was working on for Roland Penrose's, you know, the man who wrote on surrealism, who's a friend of all the surrealists. I met Michael Werner, said, well, come and work for me at the weekends and I'll teach you a lot of sculpture techniques and you can help me cast this piece. And with a couple of other young sculptors and friends, we made this 20-foot long sculpture. This is the model for it, which is then cut into sections and put into Roland Penrose's orchard, I think in Suffolk. This sort of whole thing of a teenager and my teenage years, these weekends that I spent working for Michael Werner, was really quite fantastic. I mean, it was so much more interesting than anything that was going on at school or the art school class. And I'm afraid that school very much took a second place when I started this career this early career. But Werner was very interesting because he'd been in Paris. He'd come from Germany, been in Paris before the war. He knew many, many surrealists. He'd been a friend of Giacometti. He'd worked in Stanley Hayter's studio. Just worked from a flat in Parliament Hill. He died in, I think, 89. He's not that well known, but I think it's true to say that he was known by many people in that post-war figurative tradition, being a very fine portrait sculptor as well. This is the one on the left is which is about 1/2 meter high, is sort of typical of the kind of post-war modernist sort of sculpture that he was making. The piece on the right is what he called his self-portrait as a bull, made out of resin and bronze and various other materials. And this is a 2 meter size relief panels that he modeled and cast, which I think that they were all inspired. They're both inspired by the race riots in America, the Chicago race riots in America. He's quite a politically committed man. I mean, he always saw himself as very far left. He was also actually a German aristocrat. He's called Michael Werner, but his full title was Baron Werner von Alvensleben. And his half-brother, Prince Rupert Löwenstein, was the accountant for the Rolling Stones. but he knew, very well connected, he knew a lot of poets and artists of the time, portraits of whom he would insert into these sort of agitprop relief panels that he was making. And on the right-hand side there, I think you can see a portrait of the young W.H. Auden. And he'd done portraits of Auden and many of the other poets, Stephen Spender, many people of the 30s that he'd got to know, as well as a very fine portrait of Freud, which is in the Freud Museum, in the Freud Museum in London. These are three portrait heads. He worked very much with a continental system of anatomy, which he taught me, an écorché style of modeling, which I passed on to students myself. But I found it very interesting, this very sort of German and French approach to anatomy and to anatomical structures, which I became a portrait sculptor myself. And here are two heads here of my sons, which when I construct a portrait head now, I'm always very much still in that mode of creating a bone and muscle structure that Werner taught me to work with. I'd like to just sorry, we're now.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to, yeah, okay. I want to sort of mention Willy Sukop here, who became the professor of sculpture at the Royal Academy, where I was a student. And I think in this one, you can see something of the kind of craft qualities of Austria, which have been overlaid with the influence of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, who were the two giants of the time, particularly in that sort of top left-hand image, the drawing there. Willy Sukop came to Dartington in the 30s, the 20s, I think, to work there, and I met Simone Michel, the I think very well-known contemporary dancer, who was a pioneer of the Laban technique of dance. And there was a sort of very interesting collaboration between the two. And I will say this about all the émigrés artists that I met in North London, and who were very generous in their conversations with me and their instructions, their sort of, what they were teaching me was the breadth of their cultural interests. They're all interested in the theatre, music, literature, in ways that I often found English artists weren't. I found a lot of English sculptors just want to sort of make the sculpture, and most conversations were about construction. And I found that a lot of people who come from the continents had a slightly broader approach to their practice, which is something maybe we can pick up again. This is a piece by Peter Startup, who ran the sculpture department at the Wimbledon School of Art, where I did my degree. He wasn't an émigré, but very, very fine sculptor. The Tate owns some of his work, and I hope that they'll do a nice big retrospective of his work. But the point about Peter Startup was he came from a generation that was contemporary with so many of these figurative sculptors that I was getting very excited by. Ken Armitage, Eduardo Palozzi, or that whole group of people he knew and who's introducing me to as well. So I got to know Ken Armitage, and then through Ken Armitage and a few interviews with a few other sculptors, wrote an article on sculpture of the 50s for the Art Scribe magazine when I was a student. This is a piece called Tent, which I made as part of my second year show. I made about 20 pieces of sculpture using fabric. And I'd also got very interested, partly through Riccardo and his conversations about Italian art, which ranged from the Renaissance. He was teaching art history at Wimbledon. and all the way through to what was going on with the metaphysical painters of the 20s and 30s. And my own interest in a group called Arte Povera, which were a group of contemporary Italian artists who had quite a wide influence on European art. And I started working with fabric and steel. This is another piece. These are all, about 3 meters in size, in length. Very much involved with that Arte Povera group of artists. The title just means poor art. The idea was that one took materials from the street and started to, or the warehouse, or the junkyard, and was able to create, one could see the poetic possibilities in those materials. In my final show at Wimbledon School of Art, I was making sculptures where I was pushing my body into large slabs of clay and casting that. And there's about half a dozen of these large pieces that were in this final show. I think in a way it grew from a process of drawing in a very expressive way, which I think I was very much getting from people like Auerbach and Kossoff. I was working with very thick materials, very strong materials, inks, charcoals, all sorts of materials like that, and making drawings, which then sort of led me into making these kind of three-dimensional drawings in clay. This is another piece I made using that, which on the left, using this technique of burrowing my own body into large slabs of clay. These are about, sculptures are all about 2 meters to 2.3 meters high. I very much sort of used the whole department's allowance of clay for making these pieces, working very much in the negative, trying to bypass a kind of sense of control that one might have over one's materials, always looking for the unexpected, always looking for the accident and the mistake. And I was in the Francis Bacon show quite recently and remembered what an incredible influence Francis Bacon was on all the artists of my student years. That whole sort of process of trying to make art that was just beyond your control, so that mistakes and the unexpected would bring in a fresh energy. The piece on the right was my attempt, called Horse. It was my attempt to, the piece on the left is called The Wrestlers. And again, I was sourcing photographs from Muybridge's book of photographs, which Bacon was also using. And I probably got to the Muybridge through Bacon and that extraordinary book, his interviews with David Sylvester. And the piece on the right was an attempt to actually model straight off, using a cast of a flayed horse that we had at the Royal Academy. I was at the Royal Academy by this time. Again, it's about 2.5 meters high, and was shown in the Academy galleries, which was very exciting for a student to see that there. I'm going to jump a good decade and several different sort of phases of my work, but this is I was given the Rome Award in Sculpture to work at the British School at Rome. I was there in '93. I think actually the person who's most, although she doesn't really know me, but the person who was sort of instrumental in my getting there was Philida Barlow. I'm eternally grateful for her to have had that chance to work in Rome. I've been going to Italy quite a lot. I was at the Accademia di Belle Arti as a student for a while, working in different studios and their houses and things, painting and drawing and making little sculptures. But this was the time when I had this huge studio at the British School at Rome, along with half a dozen other artists. It's absolutely, it's absolute paradise. And started casting straight from leaves. Now, you may sort of wonder how I got to this, but I think during my early years, I've been very interested in this Picasso's work, where he takes objects paints them, puts them together, paints them, covers them in paint, plaster, all sorts of other materials, and creates new images. And very much seeing the sort of metaphoric quality of rubbish and how that could then be turned into sculpture. And the Picasso Museum in Paris, which I went to, has a wonderful basement full of all the plasters. And I know when I was in Rome, at the British School at Rome, I could see all these leaves growing on the forum and actually around the school itself, the Accademia Britannica, as it's called in Rome. I started casting from them, sort of seeing the poetic possibilities of a leaf in relationship to the human figure, that the anatomy of the leaf was, in a sense, very much what the could be seen as having a reference to the anatomy of the figure. These are 2 meters high. Sorry, the previous one was 2 meters high. I then went on coming back from the paradise of that studio in Rome to what was really quite a tough life in London again. But I carried on with this area of work, and using life casts, using molds, using all sorts of different forms to control the leaf. I saw this as a sort of collaboration between myself as the sculptor and what the leaf would do, what the leaf's behavior was. These leaves grow. This is the Canthus Leaf, which grows on the forum, grows up to about 1 meter in size. I hadn't really noticed them in the UK, but they are referred to by Vesalius in his Orders of Classical Architecture, where he talks about their symbolism for the Greek civilization, and you see them at the tops of the classical column, as well as in a lot of Victorian architecture. I just thought that their kind of vigor and their energy was fantastic. Was another way of creating imagery. The leaf was a sort of became a kind of intermediary between myself and what was possible in making sculpture, sort of inner and outer worlds. The one on the right, Waiting for the Wind, is 2 meters in length. It's up on a timber trussle. It's very much inspired by Michelangelo's Night and Day sculptures in Florence. The one on the left is called Lotus. It's cast in bronze now and is on a site at Nottingham-Trent University. I then made more of these sculptures. The previous ones were a series called Leaf God, which I'd originated in Rome. These are ones that I was making in the UK, my studio in London. They're all, the one on the left, 2.5 meters high. They're all called angels. This is them seen in the atrium gallery of PricewaterhouseCoopers at Charing Cross. I'm not quite sure where the imagery for these pieces came from. I work very instinctively, but I mean, there is so much cultural input into these, not just in terms of the Italian and the Greek classical sort of origins that I've, or influence that or imagery that I've been talking about, but I think in many sort of areas of image making, oceanic arts, African art, right through South American, Mexican art. Again, very much trying to see how I could use the energy of the leaf and the sort of behavior of the leaf and how I could control that and cast from that. Each of these sculptures, all the surfaces are cast from real leaves. I found when I came back from Italy that there was a public garden at Kennington that was growing them. So I engineered a collaboration with the garden managers there to use them. And then I started growing it myself, and several neighbours were growing it. So I had a street full of leaves to use. back in London. This is 3 of the smaller pieces called Fruits of Memory. But again, you know, I'm trying to use the spine of the leaf to mimic the spine of the figure. Here's another one here. Several of these were cast into bronze and put onto different sites, both in London at Leytonstone High Road in Wales and again in Nottingham. These are 3 heads, which quite interestingly were part of the PricewaterhouseCoopers show, and they sort of became part of the installation there. Then I moved on to a group called Prophets, with these images of books, taking casts from very large map books and aligning the cast with these leaves and casting, and then making these sculptures from that. This group here, Prophets, along with this one here, another prophet called Prophet of Auguries, this is shown in the Morley Gallery, became part of the Angel Project and was seen on 6 public sites in London around the year 2000. It was very exciting to see them all on city sites in London and just outside London. I think the most extraordinary site was the public Platform for Art public site at Gloucester Road Tube Station. And to see these leafed sculptures within an urban, quite a gritty urban environment was very exciting. And actually I find them much, much more interesting when they're in urban environments than when they're in rural or environments or gardens. I was reading Simon Sharma's Landscape and Memory, and he talks quite a lot about this sort of relationship between, well, landscape and memory, but also he starts off with his childhood in Highgate and how important the Hampstead Heath was, which I very strongly identified with. But he does come up with a quote from Oscar Wilde, Oscar Wilde's The Decay of Lying, about nature constantly imitating art, which is a phrase that I really like, and I find it a really intellectually challenging line, but I think in a sense sums up what I was trying to do. There's this is a piece a metre in size on the left, one of the open books, and the piece on the right again, a metre in size, the Scroll of Leaves, in copper leaf and resin. These are 2 maquettes that I made as part of this Prophet group, one on the left and one on the right. They're not that big, about 30 centimeters high. About 50 centimeters high. But again, working on a large scale is very exciting and takes you a long way, but you also find that it's incredibly time consuming. And I also do a lot of work making smaller maquettes, which allows me to cut up things and to do things with them, which I would have not felt quite so happy to do so on the large scale. So the one on the left is actually cutting up these scrolls and inserting them around the figure in new ways, and the one on the right is the sort of start of a group called Cocoons, which you would have seen in the first item that I showed you. One in the middle is is a print, combining the print of leaves with a 2-plate print, an etching, combined with the figure. This is an installation at Leicester Botanical Gardens of the cocoon sculptures, cast out of acrylic resins with copper leaf on them. And there are now about 6 of these, which I'll be showing hopefully quite soon as a group. Now, I then had the privilege through the Royal Society of Sculptors for an award to work at a foundry in Italy, the Brian Mercer Bronze Award. And this was a great opportunity in 2017, facilitated really by Helena Blumenfeld, the sculptor Helena Blumenfeld. It allowed me to stop making these leaf sculptures and to start again, in a sense, to be a student again. And I very much wanted to come to the materials of wax and bronze as a student, or a kind of prototype student, and to see what would happen if one just sort of modeled away with hot wax in one's hand. And these are all quite small. They're all about 4 inches to 5 inches high. They sort of sit in the palm of one's hand. I made this, I had them cast into bronze at the foundry, and made these bases to look like some kind of casing that they might have come from. I was looking very much at the Etruscan sculpture in Italy. And I think, in a sense, the sort of what I'd like to sort of point out is that I think a lot of the influences of these original refugee artists that I'd met and worked for and studied with was to very much be part of Europe, to go into Europe and to get involved with a lot of European contemporary art. I wrote an article for ArtScribe on contemporary Italian art, and got to know quite a lot of Italian, a few Italian artists who I thought were really interesting. I always feel when I'm in Italy, that kind of freedom, that sort of sense, it's not, I suppose it's because it's lovely and warm, and the sense of herbs and things like that. But there is a kind of freedom there to make art, which is very exciting and very liberating. But I think these are all very much influenced by Etruscan bronzes that are found in Etruscan tombs, and this idea of the toy. And I called the show that I eventually set up at the Royal Society of Sculptors Heavy Toys, literally because I wanted to make sculptures that implied the thing of old toys, combining that with something as serious as bronze. I think in my childhood I'd made my own toys, a lot of my own toys, just out of wood and string and various materials that I found. And my mother had a toolbox under the kitchen, under the kitchen sink, and she did expect us to be able to fix everything ourselves. So that was quite an interesting start to the idea of making sculpture, that one actually might make one's own toys. And I was thinking a lot about that during this time I was in Italy. It was not long after my mother had died. And in clearing her flat, I'd found a great deal of these old toys that she'd actually kept aside. Toys I'd made, as well as these early sculptures that I'd shown you previously. And I found that very moving, this sort of idea of the toy. And it's something I wrote about in the catalogue for the introduction for the catalogue for this show. The one on the left, these are all about sort of 40, 50 centimeters high. One left is called the twins, the Gemini. The one on the right is a group of sculptures called Athena. Athena Cavallo, Athena on a horse. And I got, while in Italy at the foundry, I sort of started thinking a lot more about classical myth, and here the myth of Saturn, and the creation of the gods, as violent acts, with Saturn at the top, this open mouth. And I also sort of realized that this was referencing the theatre, and an extraordinary production of the Oresteia that I'd seen, I think it must have been back in '83 when I was really a student, in a version by Tony Harrison at the National Theatre, directed by Peter Hall, which I found incredibly stimulating in terms of sculpture. And this idea of the theatre and the classical theatre, I think, is something that's quite strong in my work. And actually, Helena Bloomfield, when she came to see these sculptures, she said the one on the right reminds her of the No Theatre, the Japanese No Theatre. So it was all like little kind of stages that I was putting together, very much just using bits of card and bits, for instance, on the sculpture on the right, the two columns left and right are just a paper, a cardboard roll coming out of a you know, like a toilet roll, you know, that kind of thing, cut in half, dipped in wax, built up, and then the whole thing then cast into bronze. But the point is that this particular period was very much, again, using this sort of arte povero Picasso idea of picking up rubbish, picking up things, and then seeing what the poetic potential might be for those things, for those objects in making sculpture. This is the creation of Athena, which this is left and right of the same sculpture. Sorry, the creation of Aphrodite, the one on the left. The sculpture is the creation of Aphrodite, again about 50 centimeters high, on these bases that I then created as sort of bases, but also as if they were boxes that the sculptures had emerged from. This is another Athena sculpture. I'm going through this quite quickly because I can see how the time is. Here, there's a piece called the Perambulator. I actually found the little little sort of baby's cradle as a little cane piece that would have been part of the Catholic tradition of a nativity scene, thrown away in the street. So I then built on that and cast it into bronze, very much taking on Picasso's idea of utilizing what you can find. Here again, you can see there's a tree dipped into wax on the back of this sculpture here. I'm going through quickly because I can see what the time is. This is a piece I'm working on at the moment, a pair of small gods. I call these all leaf gods. Again, this is about 40 centimeters high. I patinate it. This is in plaster. It's been patinated, but I'm intending to take this into bronze, as this one will be as well. So this pair here. And I'm going to end again with that shot of the studio. The figure in the center is another goddess that I've been working on, working with a model called Flora. The sculpture is called Flora. It's goddess of flowers. And when she's actually finally cast, she's at the moment in plaster, she will be carrying flowers in her arms. The two sculptures on left and right are part of the Cocoon series. And you can see another one on the far left. But I think it's now 7:15. We will stop there and hand over to Monica.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. As fully expected, that was truly interesting. Do you want to just stop screen sharing so that people can focus on you and possibly me as well, although I need to make myself visible. Good. As I've mentioned in the chat, please, now is the moment to start typing in, or indeed, I think actually if we keep it fairly informal, Stephen, if you're okay, if people want to unmute themselves and ask a question or make a comment themselves, and that's also absolutely fine, but please indicate with the hand sort of logo that that's what you'd like to do.
I'd like to.
Right, sorry, I can't actually see offhand who that is. Do you want to unmute yourself? And
I have unmuted myself.
If I go, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I was going to set the ball rolling myself, but there's clearly.
Well, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. I can't actually see.
Oh, hang on.
Talking,
my batteries just
Could you just identify yourself? Sorry, the format.
Yeah, Sue Hubbard.
Oh, Sue Hubbard, hello, nice to see you. Good,
All right.
go ahead.
I know Stephen's work pretty well in lots of ways. I mean, that I've written about it and been to his studio, and you know, we have a ongoing debate about work, about me as an art critic and as both being poets. I was really interested, though, to see the early work, which I haven't seen. And in a way, I wanted to go back to that very first one that you did, you know, from the bits of gas pipe when you were 14, which I thought was fantastic, actually. And one of the things that it made me think of, and one of the sculptures that you haven't mentioned, was Jacob Epstein's rock drill, and it made me think of that. And that you talk of that period of anxiety as well. And I suppose that perhaps I'm not being totally coherent, but what I felt looking all the way through, and I also never seen those arte povera ones, which I really, really like. It seems completely different to anything else of yours I've seen. But of course, that wasn't much in you know, with that Fontana strip down the middle, the slash. Not much interest in that here among British art schools, I don't think. How, I suppose what I'm reaching towards is how un-English the work is. And there were sort of things that came to me, and they're not really questions, just things I wanted to throw up and see how you respond to. The idea of layering and veils and disguises, and in that refugee émigré thing of the veiling of the essential self, perhaps with the leaves, or in the cocoon one, you know, these things wrapped around them. There seemed a lot of that going on as to where the centrality of the self is in them.
Yeah, I mean, it's often when you actually look at something like this that you begin to sort of see patterns emerging. I mean, for instance, the rip that you saw in that fabric of the tent sculpture going back many, many years. You know, I was also ripping paper at the time in terms of drawing. And I know that I've been ripping leaves and ripping wax and sheets of wax, and you know, this whole thing of the tear is something I've just suddenly realized it seems to be always coming through. And I wonder what the significance of that is. And I do think that you know, if we're to sort of use that sort of a metaphor of layers, I think anybody who came here in the 30s and who come here now, I mean, we're now looking at an existential crisis of Ukrainian refugees who you know, will be coming here and contributing in some way. It is exactly that thing of layers. You know, that I'm an Englishman, but I have German ancestry. I have very much a European sensibility, European sense of myself. And yet, you know, I'm very, very much a Londoner, yeah, and love it. You know, I love London. You know, I feel very comfortable in the UK, and I feel very comfortable in London, but I know that I have all these other layers. And I think that's what interests me about Monica's festival, is exactly that, is exactly the way that the second and third generation of artists and writers and musicians or whatever, I mean, we mustn't leave the sciences out of this, you know, that we have this sort of layering of sensibility and culture and reference, which I think is incredibly interesting, very valuable, and I think
it makes it a lot of non-English, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think a lot of people after the war
very different sensibility,
felt very shy about all this, felt very shy about their continental connections. But I don't think anybody is shy anymore. And, you know, certainly living in London, I mean, the number of artists I know, I would, very, very few of them are sort of traditional British. I mean, the one traditional British artist that I knew was Peter Startup, because he came from working class, I think a working class background in Hammersmith. But everybody else I knew always had some other kind of thing. Gertrude Hermes, very, very classy English lady. Her family come from Germany earlier in the last century. It's in a way, I think in a way we can sort of drop our notion of some kind of pedigree and look at the mongrel as being actually the most interesting aspect of British culture as it is at the moment. And I do think it's very interesting what one has come towards as a hybrid. I think of myself as a hybrid. I'm not quite sure what that now creates. I'm not quite sure how one might conceptualize that. But I think it's incredibly positive.
Don't you think it means different things to people of our generation than it does now? I mean, now it's totally accepted. When we were growing up, I don't think it was. I mean, my mongrel background was something that I hid rather. So I think that's what I was talking about, the veiling and the covering up.
Yeah.
I think that even unconsciously, in a sort of Freudian way, there are these sort of layers and covering up.
And I want to pay tribute to Monica's festival, because I think in a sense she's highlighted that. She's brought that to the surface in ways that I think a lot of us have sort of skirted around or have sort of not wanted to really really address. And certainly a lot of the talks given by these Monday talks given by people like myself seem to sort of bring up this sort of cultural hybridity and its power.
No, I'm flattered that you say that, Stephen. And indeed, I think the very notion of cultural hybridity has become almost a trendy one. It has become almost a mainstream concept.
Yeah.
One comment I always make when I'm giving a general lecture about the insiders outsiders theme is that precisely that is one of the main legacies. It is now almost a source of pride that one can be so many things at the same time. Absolutely. I wonder if I can just going back to very specific things. I mean, you mentioned, Sue, the rock drill, which indeed is an interesting one to think about. But what about Lazarus, that extraordinarily much later work by Epstein? I mean, it seems to me that maybe that, or maybe also the other person that occurred to me, I mean, you mentioned Helene Blumenfeld, whose work I very much respect, and I don't know if she's in the audience, I do know her personally, but also Magdalena Abakanowicz. I don't know whether she's an artist, the Polish figurative sculptor, who's somebody else who might have some bearing on what you do.
Certainly the backs and the seated figure.
Exactly.
And I think she uses that same. That's a really interesting one, Monica, because I think, doesn't she use that same sort of hollowed out?
Yeah.
You go round the front, they're empty, rather like your cocoon ones.
Did you encounter her personally at all? Did you ever meet her?
I never met her, but I knew her very much as a really important Polish artist. I got very interested in her generation of artists. There's a performer called Tadeusz Kantor who worked with a group of Polish artists called Kriko 2. He ended up in Florence, but he was doing some extraordinary theatre pieces using sculpture, and I got very interested in him as well as Magdalena Abakanowicz. So I just thought it was a stunning artist. So I never met her.
And there's actually quite a strong Holocaust connection in his work.
Absolutely.
No, indeed.
Yeah.
You mustn't hog the conversation. Sorry, Stephen, I don't want to shut you up. I'm just looking again. I do not believe there are no other people wanting to comment, but all right, I shall keep an eye on the chat. Can I just change tack slightly? I mean, you are a poet as well as a sculptor. I know you made a decision today to focus on the visual, but of course, coming from a rather extraordinarily talented family of writers, because we haven't yet mentioned your grandfather, Hans Rehfisch, who deserves, of course, a whole session to himself, and maybe one day you'll be happy to do that. But I wonder, perhaps within your own creative output, how you see the relationship between the words and the three-dimensional sculpture.
I often don't know. I mean, I'm a very instinctive person. Ever since I was a kid, I've been writing and drawing and doing different things. And I still in the studio, I'll have a book that I'm writing in, open. I find as I work as a sculptor, and I'm working away, and another part of my brain is putting words together, and they then come out onto the poetry that I write. you know, the psychology of my brain is beyond me. I just don't know how it works and why it works and what the hell it's doing half the time. But I just trust that, you know, in the forms of creation that we have, i.e. poetry, i.e. sculpture, i.e. drawing, that the discipline of those practices allows your mind to do something. You know, it gives your mind a framework. But I think that there is something about the way that a poet works with metaphor, which after all is a sort of connecting up of two unlikely elements. You know, two elements that have not been connected before is really what a poet's doing, you know, in creating metaphor. That there is a lot in sculpture and a lot in a lot of the sculptors that I'm interested in, where you see that happening, you know, that there is this conjunction of materials that are placed together and are allowed to behave together, which has a metaphoric quality. And I think that's what's happening with me. And I must admit that for a long time, for several decades, I actually divorced the two. And it was only when I was asked to be in an anthology of British sculpture published in America, the editor was Guy Portelli. He said to me, Steve, I know you're also a poet. And I said, yeah, but that won't come into it. And he said, no, that's what makes you interesting. You must put it in. So I actually talked in my entry for that anthology, that particular anthology. I did talk about this whole thing of being a poet as well as a sculptor. And I think probably I'm not actually really using it as much as I could be. I mean, maybe the next decade is going to be where I really got to kind of pull that out and make something exciting out of it. And I had been actually writing a collection of poetry about visits to sculptors' studios. Other artists that I've known, other painters and sculptors that I've known, I'm sort of using the poems to sort of cite this, and I can see one of them actually here on the screen, one of the painters here. And I often go to see friends in their studios and we talk about their work, and I write poems about it afterwards.
Perhaps I can pick up actually on something that Sue mentioned. I mean, you're interested in Arte Povera and in the early days, yeah. But it seems to me actually it ties in with what you've just been saying, that actually the big difference between your work and my understanding of that body of Italian, you know, more conceptual sort of work, it is very cerebral. It's both very cerebral and very formal or formalist at the same time, and not actually about metaphor, not really about poetry. And it seems to me that, you know, what you do rather wonderfully is to, you know, sort of extract, I think in your own term, the poetic potential of any given subject, which is obviously a way in which your two activities link together very forcibly in the three-dimensional work. Again, a comment rather than a question. There's a question, or rather, again, a comment from Jacqueline Hobson that's just come in about your transmogrification, nice word, of leaves into human figures as being rather disturbing, suggesting scars. Do you feel this use of natural materials to be negative or positive? Echoes of classical myth present, ...
Wow. I think of them, I never thought of it as negative. I think of it as very positive. I think they are slightly otherworldly. I mean, I do call them gods, and angels and prophets. They're talking about, you know, angels as a sort of intercession between worlds, between our world and other worlds. So clearly they are. I can see that they're slightly eerie, slightly perhaps some people might find them a bit disturbing. I know some people think they have an interesting science fiction element to them, and there is a guy who's been a film director who's been on to me about using some of the images for a sort of some kind of sci-fi thing he's working with. Fine, I don't mind all that. I don't want to control what people think about the work. Some people find them very sensuous and very intimate. Some people find them actually very challenging.
I thought of them as being Shakespearean, actually. The like Caliban and Eric, and they have, you know, perhaps Caliban even more. There's a sort of chthonic, you know, pulling down into the earth with them. And I hadn't thought of that until seeing them all together.
I was talking about Caliban and Ariel to another friend quite recently, and that contrast between the earthy and the airborne.
Yes, that
and,
seems to
and,
be.
and thinking about it very much in terms of the way I work, you know, and it was a play I read when I was at school, and always really liked these two strange creatures and their relationship with Prospero. This sort of father figure, or this sort of godlike father figure, Prospero, and then these two.
Are you Prospero then?
No, I think I'm looking for a Prospero.
Could I just ask?
Yes, sorry, actually, because we're highlighted, I can't actually see who's talking. Yes,
Tina Newman, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, do go ahead, sure.
From Italy. I wanted to, looking at all works which I haven't done really, and so much aid I haven't seen. When you talk about putting things together, which you do in poetry, I think someone like Giacometti, I think of his as particularly the early work of Giacometti, and I think of the sense that you achieved quite recently working in Italy foundry of bringing a lot of stuff in very fast and playing with inside and outside space, and playing with units and playing with found stuff. And you worked at tremendous speed. And I'm thinking about, because I know you write sometimes speed and you hone, but compared with the big entombed figures, some of the cocoon ones I find very mysterious, but there isn't that same sense that you are juggling with so much stuff and it's coming in from many directions. And I find the energy of that stuff made in 2017, 2018, so much about play and improvisation,
Yeah.
but of creating a whole world of things that become animate, in the sense that is throwing stuff back, suggestions back and forth.
Oh, shall we let Stephen respond if he'd like to?
Yeah, no, you know, I really pick up on what you're saying about play and the innocence of play and the delight and pleasure of play and what that potential might be. And I think it's a really important sort of, I think it's a very important part of an artist's life and a writer's, anybody. I mean, you know, somebody creating a play in the theatre, you know, has to sort of at some point have that sense of play, that delight and that the unexpected. I suppose to counter that, there is this sort of period when one has to actually go to the opposite of play, which is to construct, consolidate, to actually make a body of work consistent, to make a body of work sort of realized. And I think the problem for any artist is actually sort of making sure that consolidation doesn't then sort of discourage the play. And I have to say that I think there's probably several years of my life where I didn't have enough play. And I think that last period of in Italy when I was at the foundry, and curiously enough for a foundry which is very fixed and has a very specific way of working, I was able to actually subvert a lot of what they were doing, and get back into this play thing. And it was something interesting that Helena said to me at my interview for the fellowship when she said, your mother has died. And I think actually that's a time when one starts to reconsider a lot of those issues around play. It was a conversation that we quite a long conversation we had. And, you know, it was curious finding all these boxes of old toys, a lot of which I'd made, in her flat when I was clearing her flat. So yeah, I mean, I'm very, very keen to sort of to sustain this period of play in my life as a creative as a creative force. And I know when I was at art school making those cloth pieces, I was playing like mad, as much as I was wax in the foundry. And it's a conversation that I've had with quite a few artists during the COVID period. You know, we all said, oh, disaster, disaster, galleries are closing down, difficult to get commissions, difficult to sales, and that sort of stuff. Well, actually, it's a time when one actually forgets about all that, and one actually plays. And a lot of, I haven't shown you, there's a lot of stuff in my studio, which is just playing. I mean, you know, tricycles, kids stuff, things I picked up off the street, little scooters, things like that, put together with animal skulls and other things like that. So, you know, without worrying about what anybody's going to think about it, working very instinctively.
Stephen, we have another comment about the leaf forms, which obviously are intriguing people, including myself. My response, actually, you probably see it, my response to the leaf sculptures from Erica was to think of human skin, which, how the cells of our skin are shed like leaves, how they protect us and allow the sun to nourish us. So interesting. And it's interesting too, you seem to have returned to the motif, to the that iconography, haven't you, after a time of not having
no, it's a great comment. I mean, exactly. I mean, Erica has summed it up beautifully. And the leaf acts as an intermediary, which is something that a friend, Siobhan Piercy, another artist, said. The leaf acts as an intermediary between our world and the inner world, like, I suppose, like the skin is this strange kind of intermediary of expression between what goes on inside us and what's outside.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your technique? You've sort of touched on it, you know, at various points in your talk, but particularly let's concentrate on the leaf works. Just tell us a little bit more detail.
Well, in a way, because I'd worked for Michael Werner and these other sculptors, and I you know, did quite a lot of work for Gertrude Hermes as well. While I was a student, I was a part-time assistant to her. Well, I got very involved with this idea of the mold and the negative. And so I found myself walking around the world looking at negative shapes, you know, which could be, you know, the peel from one's orange, or a cup, or a saucer, or a bit of guttering, or a tile, you know, curved Italian tile, all these things that have negative shapes. And I actually started making the leaf sculptures by resting the leaf inside a supporting negative shape. It could be a cushion, or it could be, you know, there are many negative shapes in our world, and that cup and support the leaf, and then putting plaster into that very gently, so as not to distort the leaf too much or flatten the leaf, and actually and then taking that out of the mold, and then resculpting that leaf piece. I don't know whether that helps, but it's very much thinking about the negative as well as the positive. And then when I was making those figure pieces, I was modeling in clay, I was making molds from these figure pieces, but I was also using life casts. And I had a series of wonderful models who worked with me, dancers, performers, athletes, all sorts of people. I actually was searching London for models who were over 6'4", you know, because I wanted really tall gods, and who were really interested in the project and worked with me, letting me take life casts from them. And the last life cast actually is Flora, who's a model who I've been working with, drawing her. And then I just said to her one day, look, would you be interested in being part of my sculptures? And she said, yes, please. And so she was very happy to be life cast, and she's now part of that. I mean, she's not literally part of that, because I've actually changed the life cast, and she's much taller in my sculpture than she is in reality, which she's quite happy about too. You know, so I have a, you know, shed load of negative forms, old molds that I continue to reuse, all sorts of odd things that I see around, you know, thrown away, rubbish dump, and things like that. I mean, pain in the ass because I'm always picking up rubbish. But yeah, I'm always looking for something that has a potential, right? With a negative mold, a negative shape, something that one could then transform into a positive.
I was going to say metamorphosis seems to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
literally and poetic.
Ovid's Metamorphosis was a key text that I read when I was at the British School at Rome. You know, and I knew that it had been such an influence on the Renaissance. All those stories about transformation, and there is a wonderful sculpture by Bernini in the Borghese collection, which is right next to, which is a few yards from where my studio was, which is of Apollo touching Daphne, and she immediately erupts into leaf, and that's what's happening with the Flora sculpture. Her hands are actually growing into leaves.
Wonderful. Lovely. I'm looking at the time. I think it's probably time to start rounding things up. Last chance, everybody, to have your say. Perhaps tell us, Stephen, where else we might, I mean, you mentioned a few locations, but where might one go to see your work in the real thing, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, there's a series of public sculptures, which some which grew out of the Angels project that I mentioned before, these public sites where I installed you know, up to 20 of these sculptures with performance collaborations with several contemporary dance companies that were coming out of the place, the Contemporary Dance Centre, which was great. And I really want to do that again. I found it so stimulating to see dancers responding to my sculptures. It's absolute joy. So there is a permanent piece at Leytonstone High Road, one of them there. There is a permanent piece along the river at Vauxhall. There's a permanent piece at Lewisham College. There's a permanent piece on a site at Nottingham Trent University. There's several in sculpture parks in Wales. There needs to be more, but there will be.
not too bad.
Yeah.
Is it? I can't resist asking. Is that Erica Lewis who's chipping in? Do you know Erica's surname? I'm just wondering. Anyway, there's another comment from her. In my work, I try to express the loss of many of my ancestors in the Holocaust by using negative spaces drawn out of cocoons, which held human figures. I love the idea of cocoons as a mask, as a concealer of unknown identities. Yeah, clearly.
It's an issue I want to address more, partly because as the years have gone by, we've done a lot more family research on our ancestors and their fate in Europe during the Holocaust, and it's something I want to address more. I've offered one of the books as a memorial piece, which hasn't been picked up yet, but there are sorts of various ideas I have for exactly what is it Erica has been talking about, this idea of the cocoon, the husk, the remnant, but also I mean, what was interesting was somebody came to the studio while I was making them and saw the cocoon with a figure in it, and then saw all the cocoons without the figure, and they said it's as if somebody has left the cocoons, but somebody might arrive as well.
Yes.
Sorry, yes. Erica.
Yeah.
Yes, that's me. No, I'm fascinated by the whole idea of one's identity, which you mentioned earlier on, Stephen, when your ancestors are from a different place that they were sort of ripped out of, that they had to develop the sense of belonging somewhere else. And when that happened to one's parents and grandparents, what that's like for the grandchild, like for myself and for my children as well, how that informs who we think we are. Yeah,
and that narrative, that family narrative, absolutely.
Talking about
and how one might commemorate that too, which is an issue which I think is quite difficult. I mean, I'm not quite convinced by the Holocaust Memorial Centre designs, and I think I keep thinking that there must be ways of conveying this idea of trauma in a more poetic way.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a big conversation for
Yeah,
another day. No, absolutely. And we know, don't we, that the Westminster site has just been turned down. Interesting in itself, of course.
Yeah.
Talking about families, and one thing we haven't mentioned, Stephen, although it's been implicit, is that actually quite a lot of your time and energy has been spent over the years in making sure that your mother's work as a poet is out there in the public arena. And you mentioned a new book coming up, so maybe you'd like to tell us briefly about that.
Well, I mean, the story of her is that she published a certain amount during her lifetime, but when I was clearing her papers, I realized that there was an incredible amount of poetry that she hadn't published. So which I thought was really good. I mean, not just because it's my mother. And I published, I edited and published a book called Berlin Blues, which was poems grouped around her memories of her first 10 years in Berlin, which was well received, I think. And then a second posthumous collection was called Breaking Glass, which is her experience of the Blitz in London, where she stayed in London right through the Blitz. And in a sense, you know, I keep thinking about with this what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. And there's a third massive collection that should be coming out at the end of this year with the Right Side Left Press. I think Siobhan Harrison, the editor, is listening, which hopefully we can get together for the end of this year, which will be a really big collection of her work from that period of 1950 right up to now. Lovely. Oh, sorry, up to her death in 2015. Yeah.
Help spread the word. No, excellent.
Yeah.
Good. So I think it probably is time to round off. Let me just say a few words about other avenues you might wish to pursue via the Insiders Outsiders project. I've already mentioned Stephen's talk about Beata Duncan, his mother, which is available on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, as indeed this one will be very soon. But also you've mentioned, well, actually you haven't mentioned today, but one thing that I happen to know about Beata is that she went as a young refugee to Bunce Court in Kent. And there's actually a new book about Bunce Court that's just come out, Stephen. I don't know if you've even come across it yet, by Deborah Cadbury, and we're hoping that Deborah will herself give a talk about Bunce Court, a very rich subject. Frank Auerbach was another pupil there, for example. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you haven't yet signed up to the Insiders Outsiders newsletter, if you go to the insidersoutsiders.org website and simply scroll down to the bottom of each page, on the bottom right, I think it is, it's very easy to do so. And also this interesting, ethically and politically very contentious issue of internment, as Stephen mentioned. It has been, well, it was in 2020 the 80th anniversary of that, but we've been doing a whole series of events connected to that, and we actually do have a whole subsection on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel called Internment 1940 to 41, which might also prove of interest to some of you. So I think it only remains for me to thank Stephen ever so much, and also to Sue and indeed Erica for their useful interventions. And Stephen, I hope we will keep in touch, I'm sure, and hopefully see you again on another occasion. As I say, your grandfather really fascinates me too, and I'd like to find out more about him in due course. Good, and thank you everyone for listening attentively, and I hope to see you at future events. All the very best, and good night.
Thank you.